Chapter 7 of Dracula. Again, have your coloured pens handy, ready to annotate. So what happens in Chapter 7? Well, we have a ship with a dead man who's tied to the helm arrive in Whitby Harbour. We have Dracula's boxes being unloaded. We get to have a look at the ship captain's log from the Dementor, which tells us what happened at sea, and Mr. Swales, the old man, is found dead. So this chapter opens with a newspaper reporter commenting on the calm before the storm. And as you can see, pasted into Mina's journal is a cutting from the Daily Graph dated the 8th of August. It's looking at the calm before the storm obviously being a metaphor for the arrival of chaos brought along by Dracula. And the sudden arrival of the savage storm and the drama at sea all unfolds here. So Stoker's using a newspaper report is a clever device. He's trying to add the excuse me, verisimilitude, which is obviously the appearance of being truthful or real. So by using news clippings and the ship's logs and these chapter and later medical journals, etc., he's building a cumulative picture of events. Again, it reminds us they might actually have happened. In terms of the statement at the beginning of the article, it says, from a correspondent. So this is a little bit of AO3 and some context here, because this byline was commonly attached to newspaper articles in the Victorian era. So instead of naming the reporter, you would say that it would have from a correspondent, and it was used to preserve the anonymity of the writer, tended to suggest that the writer was, so either the writer was therefore an amateur journalist, perhaps they were a well-informed but secret source of information, or maybe they were a person who didn't have a good enough reputation, so that if they did write an article and put their name to it, people wouldn't really believe it. What's very good, though, about the idea from a correspondent is it's gender neutral. So again, this was another reason why editors used this to avoid offense. And to stop people from not reading an article because perhaps it might have been written by a woman. But I think, and all of this, please, is pure speculation on my part, and I know others have speculated this too, but as you read through the article, which is not an article in the traditional sense that we know an article, it's very biased, it's very detailed, it's very descriptive, and it reads more like a journal entry than any of the journal entries so far. So remember right at the beginning, in chapter 5, Mina spoke of wanting to be a lady journalist. So maybe this is her opportunity to do so, because if you notice, use the language and the tones very similar to Mina's journal, and very different to the other examples of journalism, which we'll find later in chapter 11. But like I say, all speculation, but just again, something for us to think on. So one of the greatest and suddenest storms on record has just been experienced here, with results both strange and unique. So right from the beginning of the chapter, Stoker is reminding us that this is supernatural. We have the storm is associated with Count Dracula. It's actually marking his arrival on the ship, the Dementor. Very Gothic in terms of the use of the weather being pathetic fallacy. So not only does it suggest that something dark and ominous is approaching, but also it creates the sense of fear, because again, Gothic events are more dramatic when they take place in the dark. So as the article goes on, it tells us all about the weather. It goes into great detail about what was going on in Whitby on that day. And if you go further down, it talks about how there was a number 2 light breeze. The Coast Guard on duty at once made report, and one old fisherman who for more than half a century has kept watch on weather signs from the East Cliff foretold in an emphatic manner the coming of a sudden storm. So we get this idea that it suggests, again, something supernatural. It suggests that although the warning is a little bit late or not given timeously enough, the warning has been issued. So we go here, it goes on to about the approach of the sunset was so very beautiful, so grand in its masses of splendidly coloured clouds, that there was quite an assemblage on the walk along the cliff in the old churchyard to enjoy the beauty. So with this reference to the beautiful sunset, which of course is in stark contrast to the evil that is approaching, the approaching storm, again, remember in terms of metaphors, sunsets could mark the end of an era, and in this case maybe mark the end of England for the characters as they know it. So this is really just telling us about the calm before the storm, and we are reminded that Dracula is the storm. So as the wind gets up, and we get this wonderful, we go through all this wonderful detail, talking about the prelude of the storm, talking about how the wind was howling, and at midnight there was a dead calm, a sultry heat, and that prevailing intensity, which the approach of thunder affects persons of a sensitive nature. So the detail again, before the arrival of the ship, which is the one we saw at the end of chapter 7, is important because again it allows us, it immerses us in this tension, in this atmosphere. We are very well aware that something evil is lurking. And it goes on to say, shortly before 10 o'clock, the stillness of the air grew quite oppressive. Note the use of the negative language, the emotive language. The silence was so marked that the bleating of the sheep or the barking of the dog in town was distinctly heard. So it's absolute quiet. It's, in fact, it's nature's silence. It's almost like the idea that it's just to remind us that animals are usually able to, or believed to be able to, pick up on supernatural entities. So the idea that maybe all of this is coming together, but at the same time that nature is holding her breath because she knows something so unnatural is on the horizon and is coming along, that even she is sat in silence. Again, note that we've got everything happens after midnight or at midnight or a little after midnight, and also note how there's the use of the senses, a lot of sensory language, especially at this point, the use of oral, hearing creates tension here, and it's always a strange sound, high overheard, booming. So it's about the idea of using sound. You could almost imagine that this would be a great script as is for a radio play, because it is so reliant on the sound and atmosphere. It then says, without warning, the tempest broke. And this is a beautiful paragraph with a rapidity which at this time seemed incredible, and even afterwards is impossible to realize. The whole aspect of nature at once became convulsed. The waves rose in growing fury, each overtopping its fellow, till in a very few minutes the lately glassy sea was like a roaring and devouring monster. Okay. Some really interesting things that we can take out of this. Firstly, it talks about without warning. This again is ironic because the storm is preceding Dracula and in a sense is a warning, but I think it's a little bit too little to act upon. Note how the descriptions that are being used are very different to the ones Mina used at the end of chapter 6, where she kept talking about things being grey. Here, of course, she's talking about the vibrancy. She talks about how things seem incredible. Okay, the whole aspect of nature being convulsed. So convulsed is to have a fit. So this is a really good opportunity to look at some close linguistic analysis within your literature. The idea that it's a tempest, yes, it means storm, but it also, to be tempestuous means to be very moody and very passionate. So it's the idea of this violence, the speed. It seemed incredible. So being incredible is again linking to the supernatural. It's this unearthly event. And it's like the whole of nature convulsed, like it had a fit, and it reacted involuntarily. the fact that the waves are personified as having growing fury, trying to overtopple one another, and the fact that the glassy sea was like a roaring and devouring monster. And again, there's the irony here, because although the sea is like one, it's also bringing a roaring and devouring monster to Whitby. Okay, so as you just go through that, notice how the language is very, very detailed. We've got lots of similes, we've got lots of alliteration and onomatopoeia metaphors. So go through this, the rest of this paragraph, and identify the different aspects and the different parts and figures of speech that Stoker has used. Bearing in mind, he wants the reader to feel overwhelmed and immersed in the storm, and that is why there's so much detail. So look for lists, triadic structures, emotive adjectives. All of these help contribute to the sense of fear and doom. Okay, and of course, why has the reporter spent so much time on this? Because the gathering storm is a major event in Whitby, and it's a sense of power and this idea of supernatural is created through these powerful descriptions of the weather. And again, tension increases for the reader who's aware of the imminent arrival of Dracula. So again, just a reminder, for those of you who've done Frankenstein and explored the idea of nature and the sublime, it's the idea of experiencing nature and experiencing natural events or natural disasters, and being able to see them with awe and terror and danger. So it's not just nature being beautiful, it's the awesomeness. So being full of awe doesn't mean that you necessarily are happy with what you see, but you are gobsmacked, and I think that's what's happening here. So we've got this ship on the horizon, and we suspect the reader here, well, we know that it's Dracula's ship, and of course we manage to, as this all continues, we manage to create a link, or make a link, between the arrival of the ship, Mr. Swales' death, Lucy's restlessness, and all of these things, and we are able to link them to Dracula's arrival in England. So it's almost seems that Stoker is giving us, or dropping hints at a little bit of information, and it's quite ironic because we are picking up on, it was dramatic irony in a sense, because we're picking up on all these little nuances and situations that the characters are unaware of. The narrator doesn't know all of the background and what is bubbling underneath, but we, the reader, do. And I think by going to such detail about the weather and how this hideous weather accompanies Dracula is not just an example of pathetic fantasy, but I think also implies to the reader, or what Stoker wants to imply to the reader, is that Count Dracula can even control the weather, which just heightens how amazing his strength and his power is. So before long, they discovered a schooner with all sails set. In other words, a ship bobbing along with its sails out, and this is Dracula's ship. And this is, people are gobsmacked, because you never have your sails set when you are in a storm. You obviously bring them all in. So everybody, the population of Whitby, comes out to see the ship, and they're gathered on the pier. And with all sails set, was rushing with such a speed that, in the words of one old salt, so an old salt is a sailor, she must fetch up somewhere if it was only in hell. So the idea that she's come out of nowhere, has she come up out of the sea, has she come from? Note as well that during this time of appearance with the ship, there's a sea fog. Fog always represents lack of clarity, lack of understanding. Could also suggest that Dracula is masking his arrival, so people cannot see the full picture. Again, also an example perhaps of pathetic fallacy in a way, because we know that with all of this comes this atmosphere, comes violence and gothic ideas. Interesting that the rays of the searchlight were kept fixed on the harbour mouth. Okay. So again, remember, light is always used to be a metaphor for knowledge, understanding, but a light, although a light can begin to cut through fog, it's not always very clear. And again, I think this is the whole idea of Dracula's arrival, people being unaware of the actual ramifications of his arrival. Anyway, the Searchlight finds at the helm, lashed to the helm was a corpse with drooping head which swung horribly to and fro at each motion of the ship. Now, the fact that the ship came in all zigzaggy and out of control is accounted for by the fact that the guy piloting the ship is in fact dead. And it says, no other form could be seen on deck at all. A great awe came on all as they realized that the ship, as if by a miracle, had found the harbor. So again, reference to words like miracles, supernatural. He's heightening this. Whereas when we went walking with Jonathan, or we were reading Jonathan's journal, things were very factual, down to earth. Jonathan had a clear explanation for everything. It was logical. Whereas this, they are referring, lots of reference to miracles, lots of reference to the supernatural. Okay. As the boat lands, an immense dog sprang up on deck from below, as if shot up by the concussion, and running forward jumped from the bow on the sand. So, immense dog, we the reader know immediately Dracula. So when they talk about an immense dog, I think you can substitute also with wolf, and as we know, he is able to control the wolves. So this is even more scary because Dracula now seems to be more than a vampire. He also seems to be a werewolf, which just casts our minds back to chapter 2, when Jonathan was looking things up in his dictionary and discovered that the word for vampire and werewolf was very, very similar. So what does it tell us? I think Stoker's suggesting, and later corroborates this, that Count Dracula is a metamorph, metamorph, which means a shapeshifter. And frightening, he seems to be able to take on the form of any animal. The fact that he is able to shift and change and alter his state certainly emphasizes the fear that maybe we can't rely on our senses and that reality is not quite what it seems. We certainly are now more inclined to believe Jonathan Harker's ideas and the journal, and understand where he's coming from. And it certainly highlights the idea that appearance is deceptive. And again, it's just more gothic and supernatural features to add to the whole sense of the supernatural. I think it's quite interesting that as we go through this, and especially if you just look a couple of lines up, the description of the dead body, who was the captain of the ship who's tied to the helm, is quite detailed and quite gory, which is very unsettling. Now, this is necessary because it's got to fill us with a sense of revulsion, because what did this to this man we cannot have sympathy for it. All right, we have to realize that it is an abomination and something that is not of God. Okay. It was no wonder that the coast guard was surprised or even awed, for not often can such a sight have been seen. The man was simply fastened by his hands, tied one over the other to a spoke of the wheel. Between the inner hand and the wood was a crucifix. Okay. This is suggesting that he's still dead, yet he's clutching tightly onto a crucifix. So it's the idea that a crucifix cannot protect you from a vampire, which is very frightening, because if God can't protect you, what or who can? So again, Stoker is suggesting that Count Dracula has immense power. Obviously, we know there are weaknesses, but they need to be found and exploited. But initially, he comes across and does appear, by all accounts, to be invincible. Obviously, all of this is investigated. There's a coroner's inquest and investigation into what happened. And I find, again, it just strikes me, and makes me think of Mina, is the poetic prose that this journalist is using. And this prose kind of emphasizes that the captain had great courage, absolutely, but it was a complete waste of his time. Because even though they were dedicated, the captain and his crew were dedicated, they did their job, they fulfilled their contract, they still lost their lives. And it kind of comes across like the when the line, the derelict ship was found her way so miraculously into harbour in the storm. It's almost as if the journalist is mistaking this, which was a disaster, and this quite miraculous that the ship just appeared, but maybe she's saying, or he's saying, that it's a result of devotion. So I think we need to be a bit careful there as well. Interestingly, the ship is a Russian from Varna. Okay, on the 9th of August, a Russian from Varna. So it's a Russian ship, it's not a Russian person. Varna is a town in Bulgaria. Do yourselves a favor if you haven't been. It was really, really lovely. And the name of the ship is the Demeter. Now, they're named after the Greek goddess of harvest and fertility. All right, she was the Greek goddess in charge of corn and grain and the harvest. She also was in charge of the cycle of life and death. So it would be a really good idea for you to go and do a bit more research into Demeter, especially her relationship with Persephone and Zeus. The word Demeter is now associated with dementia and madness, and it's very interesting if you go and have a look at why does she bring about, because she does, Demeter does bring about great desolation. So it might be worth going to have a read and have a look at what she does. So the fact that a ship is called the Demeter is the implication of this great desolation, is also a foreshadowing of events. So we've got this idea here. Stoker has, or the journalist, sorry, let's get that right. The journalist, it seems to be praising the crew and talking about how their devotion has managed to get the ship into harbour, and then this is completely juxtaposed with a petty argument about, okay, if the crew's all dead, who gets the cargo and who gets the ship? Okay. Interestingly, though, the officials of the Board of Trade have been most exacting in seeing that every compliance has been made with existing regulations. As the matter is to be 9 days' wonder, they are evidently determined that there shall be no cause of after complaint. So 9 days, just a reminder, it's a factor of 3, and therefore a magical number. I wonder, then there's this little bit about how a good deal of interest was abroad concerning the dog which landed when the ship struck, and more than a few of the members of the SPCA, which is very strong in Whitby, have tried to befriend the animal. And we are going, probably not such a good idea. Just to let you know a bit of information there, I think Stoker's poking a bit of fun at dog lovers. Because befriending Dracula is probably not the best idea, but the SPCA was founded in London in 1824. In 1840 became the Royal RSPCA, when Victoria decided to give it her stamp of approval. Just a little bit of a side thing there for you. Right, we've then got a relatively large paragraph, the last one before we go on to the ship's logs, and starts, later by the kindness of the Board of Trade Inspector, I've been permitted to look over the logbook of the Demeter, which was in order up to within 3 days, but contained nothing of special interest except as to facts of missing men. The greatest interest, however, as regard to the paper found in the bottle, was today produced at the inquest, a more strange narrative than the two between them unfolded. It's not, etc., etc. Right. So the reason why I want to draw your attention to this is that Stoker again has had very cleverly had the journalist introduce the captain's log. So we've got again a good movement from one section to the other. Now, captain's log was a form of formal record keeping, okay, not just Star Trek style, but it was used to inform, it was like a journal entry that was used to inform the ship's superiors of what happened on the mission and to record any historical facts for future generations. So, of course, the fact that Stoker has included the stylistic device again adds to the sense of authenticity and realism. So the log would have been written in Russian, since it's a Russian ship, and of course the reporter says that it has been translated into English. Interestingly, as you go through the log, we notice how the crew disappear one by one, and how this is very disconcerting, and how both the captain and the crew believe that there is in fact a monster on board the ship. Right, so we've got the log of the Dementor. Remember, cast your mind back to the epigraph at the beginning, where it talks about papers. Well, this is one of the few papers in the text that's actually written using fragmented syntax and incomplete sentences. In fact, it's more the kind of journal entry we would expect to read rather than the journal entries we've been having. So far it seems to be the closest to a journal entry. It records the travel from Varna to Whitby, and it starts with something written. So it's although they didn't set sail on the 18th of July, they did so on the 6th of July. On the 18th of July, as a postscript almost, is written at the beginning: "Things so strange happening that I shall keep accurate note henceforth till we land." So it's a warning that suggests there could be an issue with the credibility. But again, we're still inclined to believe what's going on is a ship's log. So of the nature, it's supposed to detail what happened. So even if we don't agree with what happened, it still has to record it. So, as we notice, I'm not going through this in great detail, that is really up to you, but on the 6th of July, we are told that they take on cargo, including silver sand and boxes of earth. We know these are the boxes that the gypsies were putting onto the carts. They come from the earth, is not sanctified earth, so it's not holy ground. So of course the undead can be buried in it. We are led to believe that old Dracula is actually residing in one of these boxes. As we go along, please note very short entries, incomplete sentences. It's just a quick itemization of the sequence of events, so exactly where they're going, so that they could be tracked on a map afterwards. The log, I think it's important to note that the log begins on the 6th of July, 1 week after Jonathan Harker's last journal entry. And everything starts much like everything else in this book, starts off very calm, but on the 16th of July, 10 days after they leave port, a seaman goes missing, and of course the impact on the crew is immense. And it goes, as the log progresses though, note how events start taking place that are unusual or unnatural. The writing becomes longer and more detailed, so it's becoming closer to prose as the danger grows. Interestingly, when on the 17th of July, one of the crew sees something tall and thin, so again just highlighting to us, because we know that's definitely an accurate description of Count Dracula. On the 22nd of July, they passed Gibraltar. Now, Gibraltar is important as it is, once they go through the Straits of Gibraltar, it marks the movement from east to west. So notice that as soon as at the moment they've been losing men, and we presume that is because Dracula is feeding on them in order to keep himself alive. But as soon as they pass through the Straits of Gibraltar, even the weather starts to have an adverse effect. So it starts off all well, but then it becomes rough weather, last 3 days, etc., etc. Then there seems to be a doom. So the closer the ship gets to the west, the worse things become. Again, just a reminder that notice when the terrible, scary, frightening things happen, it's always at or after midnight. And there seems to be a lot of references to hell. Please remember that hell does not seem to have the same meaning as it did for perhaps a Victorian audience, because of course we are not as much of a church-going country, and a lot of people don't believe in hell. Just to kind of put it in perspective, hell is pretty much, I think, what you would regard as your worst nightmare. For me, it would be shopping in Bluewater on bank holiday, on Boxing Day, in the Boxing Day sales for eternity. I could think of nothing worse. But for others, I think it's very, very different. So what's happening here is the fact that they keep making reference to hell just highlights what a terrible situation they're in. Soldiers are known to be very superstitious. So, for example, they're not keen. They certainly didn't used to be keen to have women on their ships. They were funny about umbrellas, etc., etc. They used to put coins on their eyes to pay the ferryman. So the fact that they're already superstitious and then these things start to go wrong, as you can imagine, the captain's having quite a hard time keeping everybody calm. And it's the calm before the minor storm. So we have these storms out at sea, but it's the calm before the monstrous storm of the chaos brought along by Dracula. As you go through, please note the change in the weather. Note the semantic field of fear. Okay, especially from the 29th of July to the 1st of August. Stoker's already told us, the reader, that there is no kind of conventional weapon that can be used to kill Dracula. So the fact that the men are so fearful and arm themselves is quite sad. Again, let me remind you about the use of midnight, etc. So when things are getting terribly stressful, they feel that the end is nigh, please note again, often calling out to God, Lord help us, lots of prayer, only God can guide us in the fog. Remember, the idea of supernatural is something that cannot be explained. Goes beyond and above the natural in terms of explanation, and of course God falls into that category. Interesting, on the 3rd of August, okay, the captain refers to the creature that he sees being like a man, so not quite a man, tall and thin and ghastly pale. Please note, reference to it is it, so it is not human, it is not animal, it is not male, it is not female. But again, the suggestion is using, by comparing it to a man, it's a point of reference for the captain, because this thing is not human, but he is determined to find it. And on the 4th of August, the tone and note of desperation is evident in the ship's log. We are reminded actually of Jonathan's final journal entry before he tries to escape, and the idea that the captain is prepared to go down with his ship, and he says it is better to die like a man, to die like a sailor in blue water. No man can object, but I'm captain, I must not leave my ship. Will go down with his ship, and hence why he ties himself to the helm. Okay, we then have a little bit of a kind of a shift again. So we're now not so much on the captain's log, but probably back to the journalist who's looking at the inquest and the coroner's report, which says, of course, the verdict was an open one. There's no evidence to adduce, and whether or not the man himself committed the murders, there's none to say. So obviously looking into what happened to the men on the ship. Many of the townsfolk see the captain as a hero, because he went down with his ship. He made sure that he didn't leave, and from reading and hearing extracts from the log, they see him as a hero. Interestingly, it says no trace has ever been found of the great dog. Okay, so the storm, the dog, the disappearing sailors, obviously we know this is all symbolic of the approaching evil, which of course is represented by Count Dracula. And the reader knows that he's the harbinger. Harbinger is the messenger, the harbinger of all this that is catastrophic. Talks about tomorrow we will see the funeral. That is the funeral of the sea captain. And of course, there's another clever way of Stoker uniting the narratives, and allowing the narrative, the text, to move to the graveyard, because of course we're going to see what Mina thinks, and we're going to find out what's going on. And remember, she and Lucy would sit up on the bench in the graveyard talking to Mr. Swales. Right, Mina Murray's journal, again change in form, yet I think it's important to note the similarity between Mina's style and that of the news clipping. As we go, again, there is nothing other than my supposing. 8th of August, again, just a reminder that this is not chronological. So in terms of, it's not set out chronologically, it's set out from different accounts. So again, maybe it is worthwhile to put each character and events for each character in chronological order. Note that Lucy was very restless. We know that this is a direct link to Count Dracula's arrival. So Mina's now going back to describe what happened, and describe the storm, etc., etc. Okay, so we were reminded again that of sleep and dreams. That means we're unable to control what's going on, and we are more susceptible to being controlled. So the fact that Lucy walks in her sleep, somnambulism, is an indication that she is therefore open to suggestion and hypnosis, and will come under Dracula's control. So now, as you can see, now we're going to the funeral. So we're jumping again. So in terms of time, the funeral of the poor sea captain, they give him a funeral, because despite all that's going on, they still believe he is deserving of a Christian burial, and because they see him as a hero. And she says the poor fellow was laid to rest quite near our seat. Remember, that's the seat where Lucy and Mina would sit and chat to Mr. Swales, and where they met him. And it says poor Lucy seemed much upset. She was restless and uneasy all the time. So she's like an animal, caged animal, and it's like she's prowling up and down, just waiting to escape. Goes on, there's additional cause, and poor old Mr. Swales was found dead, and his neck had been broken. I think it's quite interesting to note that some things, and one of them being what actually happened to Mr. Swales, how did he land with a broken neck, are never kind of fully explained. That's all we're going to get. So as to how he broke his neck, why he broke his neck, whether or not it was murder, just heightens the sense of superstition and mystery. However, when they found him, there was a look of fear and horror on his face that the men said made them shudder. Poor dear old man. Perhaps he'd seen death with his eyes. Okay. Right. Again, very ominous, because if you recall, 2 chapters ago, Mr. Swales predicted his death. Stoker suggests that the look of fear and horror is therefore not necessarily looking Dracula in the face, but it's the idea, I think, of what is to come, and maybe perhaps what hell looks like. So interestingly, I think we can now start to look at Dracula as the personification of death, and not when those that look upon him, not necessarily just him, but him and all he represents. Death follows. Mina goes on to talk about Lucy, saying, I greatly fear that she is of too supersensitive a nature to go through the world without trouble. clearly she's a very good judge of character. And again, her words have an ominous warning. She has said previously in chapter 5 that she has concerns about Lucy's extreme behaviors and her tendencies, and is worried that this is going to lead to her destruction. So I think what Stoker is doing is using kind of the sympathetic, loving language when Mina talks about Lucy. So even though she realizes that Lucy could be troublesome, instead of saying that, she says she's too super sensitive of nature, instead of saying she's just a pain. Okay, so again, just quite interesting that she already foresees that Lucy's going to come to a sticky end. Interestingly, I think it'll be best for her to go to bed tired and out physically, so I shall take her for a long walk. Typically Victorian, fresh air will help heal. But we, the reader, realize that even going for a walk in the fresh air is not going to help Lucy, because all aspects of their life have been permeated by evil.